Well, good morning, and I want to welcome you to Siu Ying's baking show. So I gotta put on my apron because we're gonna bake some bread today. And it's one of my favorite kinds of bread. It's called Super Surprise Kingdom Bread. Super Surprise Kingdom Bread it makes a lot of bread. It makes hundreds of loaves of bread. But this simple recipe comes to us from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, verse 33. Now, this particular super surprised kingdom bread requires the chef to be a woman. This is because kingdom bread inverts who we think of as the powerful. Women, according to Jesus, though not often given much power in the world, can be powerful agents in the kingdom. She is a breadwinner, so to speak. See, we are beginning to understand this surprising thing called super surprise kingdom bread, because we will begin to understand that things get turned upside down. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. People normally don't think of heroes as those who are generally weaker than everybody, but God uses the weaker that people think of as weak to grow the kingdom. So I want us to think, who can this woman really be? She's a metaphor. So take a few moments to consider if you've ever met this woman, someone who wasn't so powerful by the world standards, but was very powerful for the kingdom. Did she come to you in an unexpected place? And what was surprising about her? Now, this one is only the first part of super surprise kingdom bread. The recipe says that she takes yeast. Yeast, as you know, are very small cellular organisms. With these little creatures, without them, you would only have flat crackers called unleavened bread. The yeast, or the leaven, contains enzymes that are able to break down the starch. And then once it breaks down the starch into sugars, it has another set of enzymes that breaks down the sugar into carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is this gas that makes the dough grow and get fluffy. But let's consider yeast. Back in Jesus' day, yeast was considered ritually unclean. This is because during the Exodus, when the Israelites ran away from Pharaoh, they didn't have time to wait for their bread to rise. So they didn't put yeast in their dough. And every year on Passover, this journey is commemorated, and they eat unleavened bread. The Jews eat unleavened bread. And some of the rules around leaven are associated with the Passover. So during this time, according to Deuteronomy, it says, you shall not have leaven in your territory for 7 days. So sometimes that's thought of as your house. So they would clean out the house of leaven for 7 days for the celebration of the Passover. Eventually, though, leaven or yeast got associated with something negative, like moral corruption, egotism, and laxity. Jesus even called the teachings of the Pharisees yeast. And he warned his disciples to avoid the yeast of the Pharisees. Even though yeast has a negative connotation eventually, and it was considered ritually unclean, it wasn't generally considered bad. It's just that it was inappropriate for good religion. So anything that would be religiously correct and religiously pure wouldn't include yeast. So this is another surprise. Instead of comparing the kingdom of God to something that would be ritually clean, Jesus prefers to use something considered ritually unclean. Now, why would Jesus do this? Think about it. Why would Jesus prefer to use a ritually unclean metaphor as a metaphor for how the kingdom can grow? Where have you seen something so small, so ordinary, and perhaps even impure become something so much more, become something that has helped you grow closer to God? Now it's time to add our flour. Let's see. How much flour do we need? She takes 3 measures of flour. 3 measures of flour? Whoa, that's a lot of flour. That's 60 pounds of flour. Okay, so this bag of flour is 5 pounds. I need 60 pounds of flour. I need 12 bags of this flour. I think I'm gonna need a bigger bowl. This recipe doesn't make any sense. It betrays the logic of baking. One of us who has baked know you don't use just a little leaven for 12 bags of flour. It doesn't make sense. Now, why would Jesus say this? Why would Jesus compare a little yeast to a lot of flour and the way the kingdom works? The kingdom doesn't seem to follow normal logic. This is another surprise of super surprise kingdom bread. Now let's wonder, why is Jesus betraying the logic of baking? To illustrate the lack of logic in the way we think about how the kingdom works. Think about this. What does this mean about the logic of the kingdom? Now, after we add these 12 bags of flour and the yeast, and eventually some water, it's going to make a lot of bread. What does this mean about what the reign of God looks like with all this bread? Let's just imagine all the bread we can make with the 12 bags of flour and the little bit of yeast. How many people can be fed from this amount of dough? Now, okay, so let's think about what's next. The woman has added the flour and she's kneaded it, which I would imagine takes a long time, and it takes a lot of strength and a lot of endurance and a lot of commitment. But with that much flour, it's going to take a long time for the yeast to multiply. Who can wait that long? Who is willing to wait that long for that little amount of yeast to multiply in all that flour. We want to eat bread now, don't we? We want our bread always, all the time. But according to this recipe, we're going to have to wait a long time. And when we wait a long time, we have to take care of the dough so it doesn't get dry. So we might have to spritz it. And we have to keep it warm so that it keeps the yeast nice and happy. So all this waiting also demands some of our tender love and care. But we still are waiting for this bread for a long time. So this recipe tells us that the kingdom of heaven is both here and not fully here. This is a nature of the kingdom. It's now and not yet. So this is part of the tough surprise of Super Surprise Kingdom Bread. All the waiting. This is not a fun surprise. All that great vision, all that promise and hope, and now we just sit and stare at the dough, spritzing it and keeping it warm. I'm not sure how many of us are up for that. The theologian James Allison describes hope as waiting for something that is real, that is going to happen. In that way, it is very different from wishing for something, where you don't know if it will happen. But hoping is knowing that something will happen. It just hasn't happened yet, at least not in its fullness. If you're lucky enough, you can compare it to someone who is waiting for their inheritance. They know that they're in the will, but they haven't received their money yet. And hope is like that. You know it's going to happen, but it hasn't finished happening. So what we have to do in between is wait. The community of Matthew was waiting for the fulfillment of the kingdom. They saw all the ingredients. They had the yeast, they had the flour, they watched the dough rise, they kneaded it, but they kept waiting. And they wanted to see the fulfillment. They could even see how many people could be fed. But they hadn't eaten yet of the bread. They lived in the tension in the in-between of they saw the beginning, they could foresee the end, but they lived in that tension of the in-between. And even for us today, we live in the tension of the in-between. The bread is not fully baked. We too still have to wait. Do you like to wait? What does it feel like to wait? Let's take 5 seconds to just think of the feeling we have when we have to wait. When was the last time you had to wait? How did you feel? What do you get tired of when you're waiting? What does trusting God and waiting what does trusting in God have to do with waiting? Have you thought of what trust looks like in a time of waiting? Well, we're all waiting now. Coronatide makes us all waiters. Some of us thought that maybe 2 months was long enough. Now we're 4 months into our shelter in place. How much longer? The tough surprise is that it will be much, much longer. It will be much longer before a reliable treatment or cure. Right now, we wait and wait. And some of us are tired of waiting. We don't want to wait anymore. We don't want to spritz the dough. We don't want to keep it warm. We just want what we want. And God is too slow to do our bidding. But we are a community called for hope of the fulfillment of the kingdom of God. So what is a faithful response while we wait, while we trust in God? In this time of waiting, we can begin to imagine a new way of organizing our life together while we wait. The kingdom of God is moving in one direction, toward transformation, toward growth, and toward change. The flour starch is already breaking down, and then the sugars will transform from solids to gas, and the CO2 will dissipate. It will never return to what it was. It will never return to just a bit of yeast and lots of flour and some water. It is becoming bread. All this breakdown, and surprisingly, it becomes nourishment. This is the grand surprise of Super Surprise Kingdom Bread. Breakdown leads to nourishment, which leads to life. It is as if death can also mean new life. So the final question for us to ponder today is, where are you in this recipe? This will be the question for you to ponder together in the sermon discussion breakout groups. Where are you in the parable? Well, that's it for today's lesson in baking Super Surprise Kingdom Bread on Siu Ying's Baking Show. Next week, we will make the bread of affliction from the book of Deuteronomy. I hope it won't be too painful. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week on Siu Ying's Baking Show.